Hey, it's Huck. And I gotta tell you, I pity the poor liberal folks who live down in Alabama. Just like I feel real compassion for all those global climate change activists living amidst the science-denying political climate of Texas. And how about our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters living in Bible-toting regions of South Carolina? Or people who are calling for some sensible gun reform while living outside a Camp Lejeune down in Raleigh, North Carolina. Just how does a free-thinking, science-subscribing, fact-checking liberal maintain sanity surrounded by surrogates of the wacky, facts, schmacks, conspiracy-obsessed, hardcore conservative right? Sadly, even here in Ohio, a state so purple it perfectly matches the color of my face whenever I remember that this state elected Wall Street bred Republican Governor John Kasich. Even here in Ohio, we have some recent experience in putting up with red state-like political lunacy. For a purple state with more registered Democrats than Republicans, we have a decidedly Republican legislature thanks to decades of non-stop partisan gerrymandering that has given Republicans 2/3 majorities in both our State House and State Senate. Their attempt to bust unions back in 2011 was something called Senate Bill 5, was overturned at the polls in dramatic fashion when 2 million citizens signed a petition that put that law up for a public vote, and Ohioans stood up and defeated that law with more than 60% of the vote. But because unions have become such an integral part of Democratic funding, you can't expect these folks to give up so easily. And so now, Kasich and his Looney Tune friends in the legislature are proposing a right-to-work bill that would basically achieve the same union-crushing effect. Only this time, they're writing it in such a way as to make it impossible to be put up for a public referendum vote. As a liberal, this kind of thing infuriates me. Not just because as unions fail, so fails middle-class income, but because when I try to explain this to my more conservative friends, that low-wage jobs and high corporate profits are the problem, not the solution, that Kasich and his Republicans have slashed 51,000 state jobs since taking office in 2010, and slashed 51% of the state's budget for the Ohio Consumer Council, which advocates for consumers in complaints, regulatory hearings, and court cases against gas, oil, and utility companies. No wonder fracking is exploding all over the state. Fact is, the mainstream press does a pretty piss-poor job of letting folks in these red and purple states know exactly what their Republican legislatures are proposing, or worse, enacting, in the way of senseless anti-woman, anti-gay, anti-union, or racist laws in their states. And liberals in these states who see all this stuff happening often feel absolutely powerless to stop it. A whole slew of Republican-led states have enacted harsh new anti-abortion bills just in the past 2 years, including every nefarious trick in the book aimed at shutting down any and all health services clinics that might also happen to perform abortions. Red and purple states alike have joined in the chorus of enacting new restrictions on traditionally Democrat-leaning black, Hispanic, and young voters, even after this worked so miserably for them in the 2012 election. 2 states have taken this a step further. North Carolina hopes to curtail college students from voting by removing their dependent status on their parents' income tax forms for any students who register to vote. Ohio, yes, purple state Ohio, is using another method to curtail student voting. The plan is to give colleges an incentive to prevent student voter registration on campuses by forcing colleges who allow out-of-state students who register to pay in-state tuition rather than the much higher costs colleges get when they charge these same students out-of-state tuition. The larger the college, the more the universities lose. And since something like 70% of students vote Democrat in Ohio, and few ever use snail mail absentee ballots, this case, like North Carolina's, will likely have to wind its way all the way to the Supreme Court before ultimately being overturned. Republicans hope that won't happen until after the 2014 election. My heart goes out to our liberal brothers and sisters living in Kansas. I've been very vocal about my feelings for strict new gun regulations, well beyond those moderate proposals recently offered up and filibustered by Republicans in Washington. So I can only imagine the outrage and frustration progressives in the state of Kansas must harbor after that state signed into law a bill that states that any federal law infringing on the Second Amendment is null and void in the state. It's a felony for a federal official to even attempt to enforce a federal firearms regulation in the state of Kansas. Yeah, I know. This is another law that really does nothing because in the end, not only is it unenforceable, but ultimately it will almost certainly be struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court whenever that time happens to come. But, like other officials in other red states who have also said they will ignore any new federal gun laws, I'm reminded of the bitter fight to the last man standing civil war in this country. And whether you want to face up to it or not, all-out civil war seems to be the destination our increasingly extremist far-right elected officials are determined to reenact. Now, one of my very favorite bloggers is the Rude Pundit. There's a link in the description box below. Spoiler alert, he's as profane as he is liberal, so don't go there if the F word or pornographic sexual references offend you. Now, in a recent column, the Rude Pundit suggested that red states like Kansas, North Carolina, and Florida, who enact legislation disowning or circumventing federal laws like the Voting Rights Act, or like federal firearm regulations, religious freedom, or abortion rights, should be forced to give up the windfall profits they earned in federal tax dollars. The Rude Pundit points out that it seems that for every federal dollar they contribute, many of these red states get back a lot more in return. While blue states like New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts pay more federal tax dollars than they ever get back, states like Kansas pay less than they get in return. Alabama, apparently, is the worst in this regard, getting back more than $2 for every $1 of federal taxes they pay in. What, the Rude Pundit asks, would these states do if the federal government said, fine, you want to ignore the fact that you're a member of the United States? You can go it alone. Forget all the federal dollars that build and maintain those military bases and the income they bring to your communities. Fund your own highway construction, your own schools and parks, and community block grants. See how many businesses you attract and jobs you lose when the federal government leaves you on your own. The added cost per Alabama citizen would be thousands of dollars per citizen to keep these things in place. But if that's what you want, hey, don't let us stop you. And while this sort of tough love approach seems somehow appropriate to those of us on the liberal side of the fence, it really isn't. Partly because about 40% of the folks living in these states are also being punished by withholding that federal tax dollar. And partly because folks all over the country benefit from federal dollars going to places like Mobile, Alabama, and Oklahoma City. The federal EPA offices in red states are crucially important, pathetically underfunded as they may be, since many red state EPAs are often stripped completely of any regulatory authority. We only need to look at recent events in Texas to see how that works. But also because this is precisely why we have a federal government, passing into law universally held rules and regulations that all folks, no matter how reluctant, have to subscribe to, and to fund the things disproportionately that states by themselves, or at least some states, would be either unwilling or unable to do by themselves. We should not allow bigots in one state, for instance, to return to segregation policies merely because they are represented by a majority in elected leadership at any given point in time. Of all the reasons for electing Obama in 2012, and hopefully another Democrat in 2016, most important is because over time, our federal courts and the Supreme Court may return to a more liberal, or at least moderate, constitutional view. Because in the end, even as conservative as the present court is construed, even this hard-right majority court, I believe, will view many of the egregious laws being currently passed in red and purple states as unconstitutional. And because while we liberals are beginning to see just how secessionist crazy some on the right have become, we cannot allow ourselves to be caught up in this secessionist game. Revoking federal tax dollars on a limited scale, as we've done in the past, for instance with highway construction money, that's one thing, and we could consider that. But massive withholding of federal dollars is about as crazy a policy as the policies that have us so worked up. But that still leaves us pondering how frustrating and untenable life must be like for liberals living in the reddest of states. Now at work, we have a television that folks can watch, and the remote is out there for any one of our hotel's guests to change the channel. I invariably set it in the morning to the Weather Channel. But time and again, particularly when we have red state male guests, the lunatic rantings of Fox and Friends comes wafting at me from the breakfast area. I am never shy about leaving the sanctuary of the front desk, meandering to wherever the remote is located, and changing the channel to either a local news channel or, when I'm feeling particularly spry, MSNBC. When confronted, as often I am, I say they can consider this either a reality check or what they should expect of life in a communist state, whichever they prefer. But then again, in Ohio, I don't live in fear that I'm going to get a key job on my car for sporting a Sherrod Brown for Senate bumper sticker. And I didn't experience seeing Nazi swastikas spray painted on my home for displaying an Obama sign in my lawn this past election. And when I get around to checking my Facebook page, which I seldom do, there's really only 3 or 4 of my friends out of maybe 103 or so who post the kind of "Obama is a socialist, let's impeach the black bastard," right-wing whack job rhetoric we've all seen vomited on our Facebook feeds at one time or another. So I wonder, do liberals in Alabama see even more of this stuff on their Facebook page? Do they fear discussing politics around the dinner table at family gatherings? Is Fox News on every public TV set in Dallas? When the football games are over, I mean. Or is there a hotel somewhere in the heart of Texas that has the sheer temerity to turn the dial to MSNBC? And do liberals in Mississippi or South Carolina even dare to put up a sign supporting the Democrat in the upcoming election? Or are they closet Democrats who fear the consequences of coming out? once in a while, I get worked up enough to do a little fact-checking to correct some of those crazy Facebook postings I see. And while my efforts rarely if ever result in a reasoned response, I pride myself that at the very least I manage to maintain a level of cordial, mutual respect, if not enlightenment, with my errant Facebook friends. I will never concede my principles for the convenience of keeping the peace, but if we are ever going to overcome ignorance and unreasoned hate, we're going to have to keep the conversation going. One lesson we can take from the great Civil War, this nation's bloodiest conflict, along with realizing its inevitability as the price this nation had to pay for the abomination of slavery. It's taught us that using force to conquer your foe is different from conquering their ignorance and bigotry. Somehow, those remained. I'd be a whole lot more receptive to hearing ideas on how to conquer those. My guess is that, for one, we progressive thinkers, wherever we happen to live, need to stand up and speak out for the things we believe. No, some minds will never change, and maybe where we live, that's a whole lot of folks. But we will make it much easier for those in the closet to come out, and we'll give the next generation who hold such promise for the future models that they may desperately need because they are surrounded by lunacy too. Anyway, I'm Huck. Thanks for watching, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this subject. Maybe you're a liberal living in the heart of red state America. So please comment below, and don't be afraid to share this with any friends you might know. I'd really appreciate that. See you next week.